19mm socket. Let's take all 5 of the lug nuts off and then remove the wheel. Take the hubcap off, if you have one. Take the wheel off. Let's take off the axle nut, 32mm socket. $18mm socket, remove these 2 bolts, and then we'll take the caliper with the bracket off of the knuckle. Leave this in a little bit, take the top one off. Okay, hold this in place so it doesn't fall when you remove the bolts. That's still stuck. There we go, pulled the caliper off the rotor, and I'm going to set it up on the strut assembly here. That way it doesn't put any pressure on the brake hose. Take the rotor off. If yours is stuck due to rust, you can just hammer right in between the studs. That should break it free. There are 4 15mm bolts, 1 on each corner. That's what holds your wheel bearing on. So push the axle out. That way you can get your socket in here and take all 4 out. There's one. All right, one more. There we go, that's all 4 of them. At this point we have to hammer the wheel bearing off. It's just held in there with rust and pressure, so I'm going to use my hammer and just hammer it from side to side, kind of walk it back and forth. I can see that it's breaking free. It's going to come off any second. There it is. So now I want to clean this area up. You don't want any of this rust here, otherwise the wheel bearing won't seat itself properly. And you want to pay attention for your ABS sensor. You don't want to damage that. And what you can do, depending on how much rust you have, either scrape it off, sand it off with sandpaper or a sanding disc. Basically, you just want to get rid of all of this. That way there's a nice clean surface for the new wheel bearing to mount. So I cleaned this area off on the outside. It's important because this is where it bolts on. And then I cleaned the lip on the inside here as best as I could. That way the wheel bearing can slide in and bottom out all the way. Now let's clean all this off. I'm going to use some brake parts cleaner and just get all the debris and the dust off. Clean off the splines on the axle too, and then we'll apply some anti-seize. That way, hopefully, this rust doesn't build up in the future. Apply some anti-seize. Just a thin layer will do. Make sure you get inside there. Try to avoid the ABS sensor if possible, but if a little bit gets on it, that's fine. And then I like to put it on the splines of the axle as well. This is going to help the axle not get stuck inside the bearing in the future. Get your new wheel bearing, and you can see that it has 2 holes on the top that are closer together and 2 on the bottom that are closer together, and that's how it goes. So it basically goes the long way, this way. Slide it on, line it up with the splines of the axle, and it should slide in all the way and bottom out without any sort of hammering or pushing. That's how you know that you cleaned up the knuckle enough. If you have to hammer it in, obviously there's an issue. Now let's start the bolts in, push the axle in, that way the bolts can slide into position. Then once all 4 are into their corresponding holes, I'm going to move this bearing around, and that'll hopefully line up the threads. It doesn't always line up first try. Let's see. All right, so this one started. I'm going to start the other top one as well. Yep, that one started as well. You definitely want to start these by hand. That way they don't cross thread. And then the bottom ones, there we go. And last one, perfect. All right, let's snug them up. Okay, let's snug all 4 of these up and then we'll torque them to 35 foot-pounds. I'm gonna snug them up in a cross pattern, so I'm gonna start here, then move up top, then here, then down below. That way the wheel bearing can seat itself properly. Oops. Okay. I know you probably can't see this, but I'm at the top other side. And last one on the bottom here. All right, let's torque it to 35 foot-pounds. Now that I snug them in a cross pattern, I can just go around in a circle and torque them. It's a good idea to coat this hub in some anti-seize. Mainly you want to coat this outer lip and this inner lip here. That's where the rotor sits, and you don't want rust building up in there. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs if possible. Let's put the axle nut on. I'm going to bottom it out with my air gun, but I'm not going to torque it with this. I'm going to use my torque wrench and torque it to 97 foot-pounds. I'm going to stick my long pry bar through the lug studs to prevent the hub from spinning. And then I'm going to torque this nut to 118 foot-pounds. That's it right there. Next, put your rotor on. If you are using your old rotor, obviously I have a new one, but if you're using your old one, check the inside of the hat, make sure it's clean and it doesn't have any rust buildup in there. Then slide it on. Grab your caliper, slide it over the rotor, and start on your 2 caliper bolts. Let's bottom these 2 out and then we'll torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Let's put the wheel back on. On this particular model, this hubcap has to go on before the lug nuts because it gets held on by the lug nuts. So just make sure you match up this slot here with your valve stem. Push everything on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Snug them up.